Rendermap is a tool that lets us bake the effects from our shaders into texture maps. And at the moment, all of this is driven by a combination of render tree shaders. If I just grab that cloth object there and refresh, I could actually have this simplified somewhat by actually creating a single texture map. What I'm actually going to do here is use a unique UV projection to unwrap this character, essentially. And then I'm going to kind of go in and write that to a texture map that I can apply back to the character. So first of all, I'm going to give this character a projection. I'm going to give him a projection in the XY plane, take basically a front snapshot and a back snapshot, and distribute the texture over that surface in the render map tool. So I'll go in and I'll create a texture projection, an XY planar projection. And if I open up the texture editor inside of XSI, I'll go to View, Rendering Texturing into the texture editor. I'll switch to the texture projection I just created. This is the original Mulcore projection. So I have that. And from here, I'll just select the polygons that I can see, the front-facing polygons. So for that, I'm actually just going to quickly go in textured mode here. Remember a tool we used earlier on. If I was to go in and select all of these polygons from the front view right now, it selects polygons in the back of the character as well. Well, in order to select just half of the character very quickly, I'm going to quickly change to a quick preference, tools, a selection tool, and it's a rectangle select raycast in shaded mode. It's a very handy tool that I like to use just to do quick front and back projections. So now when I select half of my character, I'm not selecting any of the polys at the back. Gotta make sure that I definitely don't have some polygons selected. Okay, that looks good there. And I'll just cut them off right about this point here. Okay, get on the inside. And let's clean this side up here quickly. There we go. And there we go. Alright, that looks good. So back in the texture editor, back on the set of UVs I want to edit, I'm just going to hit the refresh button. And I want to turn on tearing mode. If I try and pull these UVs apart right now, they're just going to stretch. There's going to be a large seam between the front and back. But if I turn on the tearing mode and pull them apart, everything looks a little bit better. I'm going to take both halves now, select them both, and I'm going to move the pivot by activating the Move Pivot tool. I'm going to move the pivot back to the bottom right corner of the texture editor and turn it off, actually turn it back on, and scale. So I'm going to right click and scale down to size. I probably want to rename my UVs before I write to them. So I'll close down the texture editor, and if I open up the selection menu and go into the clusters folder in the texture coordinates, there is my planar texture projection. If I click on the icon, I'll rename the projection. I'll call this the clothing UVs. And now I can write to render map. I can write to a texture map using render map. So again, we have our texture map ready to render off. I'll select the geometry for the character and apply a render map property. Get property render map. And with render map, I'm going to first of all specify what I want to render. I want to render the entire surface of the character. And I want to render at a fairly large size. I'm going to render a 2K square map. And I want to use the clothing UVs that I've just unwrapped to basically stamp my texture onto. And I'm going to actually create a file in the following location. So in my training project, render pictures, I'll create a file called clothing render map. I'll write it to a target format, and I'm really only concerned with the surface color. I don't really care for the lighting and the illumination on the object. So pure albedo map. That's really it. From this point I can generate the render map, and basically it'll be using a ray casting process within Mental Ray to generate a texture map of my render tree. So we're generating our render map here, and now it's done. If I open up the browser, I'll move down to the Render Pictures folder, and if I switch to thumbnail view and actually just do modified date, there's my clothing render map. It's quite large, it's 16 megs, but it's definitely functional. I can do a little bit of work on it. I can actually just paint on it if I wanted to create another texture map. But I'm going to take this now and apply it as a texture map to my character. I may want to actually go in and size it down somewhat, as 2K is quite, or 16 megabyte texture is quite excessive. So to do that, I'm going to actually open up a flipbook, open up the clothing render map, and maybe export it as a JPEG. So I'll open up that image there. So that's a pretty big texture map, and so I'll just go in and do an export. To the Render Pictures folder, and I'll call it JPEG. I'll call it low-res clothing texture. Okay. I'll add some compression to it, do something like that, and export it. There we go. Okay, so now I've got a JPEG, and if I do a properties on it, it's only 152K, so that's a little bit easier to deal with. So I'm going to bring that image into my render tree now just by dragging and dropping to create an instance. And instead of using this setup, I'm now going to go into a texture node, bring in an image node which holds a set of UVs and a picture file. I'll connect my clothing to the texture input of the UV managing image node and connect that to the diffuse channel of my Phong preset. Of course, I need to tell the image node how the UVs are distributed. I'm going to be using the clothing UV set that I've created. So now when I render, I actually have the clothing right on my character. So I've used vertex maps to create an actual texture map, useful in Mental Ray. So that's kind of what I wanted to go over. There was one other thing that I wanted to touch on as well too, the use of actually editing textures in the effects tree.